Today I will continue talking about the podcast. And the main theme for tonight is how to choose a podcast host. I have done a video about this earlier where I compared 5 hosts using 5 criteria. And those were Buzzsprout, Spreaker, Podbean, Anchor, and Acast. Tonight I want to talk about just the criteria for choosing your host. I will have a link to that video in the description of this. But as I said, tonight I just want to talk about what criteria should you look for when you compare hosts. Because one thing is for sure, just compare different hosts before you pick one. And compared to YouTube, it's much easier to move a podcast later on from one host to another, but it's still work. So think for the future when you pick your host. One thing I won't talk about today that is really, really important is the cost. There are free alternatives and there are paid alternatives. The reason I choose not to talk about the price is because that all depends on your situation. So I'm going to talk about the 5 criteria that I think is really important to look for when you compare different podcast hosts. And I have ranked them according to what I have found most important. Number 5 is possibility for monetization. When you just start a podcast, this is not very important because you have to build your podcast and an audience before you start to try get monetized. Therefore, I put this as number 5. On number 4 on my list is to look for the host, what possibilities you have to build a website. The reason I put this as number 4 is that today you have so many different places where you can build a website for your podcast, and many of them are very affordable or free. Number 3 that I think is more important when you start, it is what upgrades and add-ons your podcast have to offer. Number 2 on my list is analytics. Compared to YouTube, no podcast host has a great analytics. In podcasting, it is so much more complicated. I think comparing analytics from one host to another can be a very important factor when you choose your podcast host. And that's why that was number 2 on my list. Number 1 is how much storage and how long do they save your episode. There are hosts that never delete your episodes. One of those are Anchor, but there are other reasons why I didn't choose Anchor this time. I have also done a whole series about using Anchor as your podcast host. So if you're interested in that, I should link that in the description. But storage was the most important factor for me when it came to choosing a podcast host. I don't wanted a time limit where they take away my episodes. And even though that meant that I had to pay for my podcast host, those other parts of what I just talked about, analytics, upgrades, website, which I don't need, and monetization, outweighed Anchor in this case, and I went with Buzzsprout.